Worst number 4. Chevrolet Malibu. The 1978 Malibu was not the same car as the 1977 Malibu. General Motors downsized the entire midsize lineup in response to the fuel crisis, and the results confirmed that speed, not incompetence, was the primary issue. The new Malibu was lighter, more fuel efficient, and smaller. The rear side windows on the coupe and sedan were fixed in place. They did not open. GM cited weight savings and reduced door mechanism complexity as the engineering rationale. Every adult who rode in the back seat of a 1978 Malibu on a day above 80 degrees without functioning air conditioning provided a different rationale. The buyer, who paid mid-size money, expected mid-size comfort. The fixed windows turned the cabin into a greenhouse, and the label on the check did not account for that. The downsized Malibu was not a bad car in the fundamental sense. The engine ran, the transmission worked, and the fuel economy was better than the car it replaced. The specific failure was one of omission. GM removed a feature so basic that its absence registered as an insult to the buyer who paid mid-size money for a car that its own engineers had quietly decided did not need to ventilate properly. The Malibu earns the 4th spot on this list not because it was dangerous or unreliable, but because it represents GM's specific habit of cost-cutting in places that buyers only discover after the check clears. The 1978 Malibu's passengers knew on the first warm afternoon exactly where the savings had come from. Best number 4. Chevrolet Caprice Classic. The Chevrolet Caprice Classic was the best full-size car the company built in the 1970s, positioned above the Impala in trim and refinement, sharing the same B-body platform and V8 engine options, and delivering the specific combination of interior space, highway comfort, and modest visual distinction that the American family of the decade required from a premium Chevrolet. Through the early to mid-1970s, before the oil crisis permanently altered what buyers were willing to accept in a full-size car, the Caprice Classic represented the Chevrolet lineup's most persuasive argument for why a buyer should choose the most refined configuration rather than the base model. The Caprice Classic's velour interior, its optional power accessories, and the bench seating configuration that carried 5 adults across a 12-hour drive without generating complaints were not engineering achievements. They were the correct application of available components to a clearly defined buyer requirement. That clarity of purpose earns the Caprice its position here. In a decade when Chevrolet was simultaneously producing the Vega, the Monza, and the Chevette, the Caprice Classic represented the other side of the company's capability, a car built with the confidence that comes from understanding exactly what the buyer needs and delivering it without shortcut. The Caprice Classic is the 4th best 1970s Chevy because it did what it promised, entirely, for every mile the buyer drove it. Worst number 3. Chevrolet Chevette. The Chevrolet Chevette was not built to be impressive. It was built to demonstrate that the Chevrolet Vega's catastrophic failure had not permanently disqualified General Motors from competing in the subcompact segment, an objective it achieved with the minimum ambition required to be considered a success. The Chevette ran, it started in cold weather, its body did not dissolve in the rain on the same timeline as the Vega. These were the standards it needed to meet, and it met them without exceeding them in any direction. The 1.4-liter and 1.6-liter engines produced outputs that drivers in adjacent lanes encountered without concern. The interior presented the functional minimalism of a vehicle designed by accountants working from a list of features with a budget applied to each, with the lowest number chosen in each column. Handling was sufficient, highway presence was absent. The Chevette earns the 3rd spot on this list not because it failed in the way the Vega failed, catastrophically, memorably, and legally, but because it succeeded in the most mediocre way possible and called that acceptable. The buyer who needed the cheapest new Chevrolet in 1978 bought a Chevette and received precisely the car that $3,600 bought in 1978, with nothing beyond the transaction itself to recommend it.
Best number 3.
Chevrolet CK Pickup. The third-generation Chevrolet CK pickup, known to its admirers as the square body, arrived for the 1973 model year, with proportions so clean and purposeful that the design has not stopped being reproduced in some form in the 40 years since. The truck was everything its predecessor had been in terms of mechanical capability, and something the predecessor had not been: visually correct. The cab proportions, the flat hood, the simple line from cab to bed, a design team that had been trying to make a truck look like a truck and nothing else got it right, and the market confirmed this almost immediately. The CK's inline-6 and V8 engine options gave American contractors, farmers, tradespeople, and the increasing number of buyers who simply preferred a truck for everything the powertrains that ran for hundreds of thousands of miles on the maintenance schedule that working owners could realistically sustain. The Cheyenne and Scottsdale trim packages began the transformation from work tool toward daily driver, a transition that the 1970s initiated and that the following decades completed. The square-body CK is the third best 1970s Chevy because its combination of visual identity, mechanical reliability, and cultural timing made it the truck that changed what American buyers decided a truck was allowed to be. It was the beginning of the truck era. The beginning of it was this truck. Worst, number 2. Chevrolet Monza. The Chevrolet Monza arrived in 1975 as the Vega's platform mate, a sleeker, sporty-looking coupe built on the same H-body architecture that the Vega had already demonstrated was capable of spectacular failure in the right conditions. General Motors had not solved the Vega's fundamental problems before deploying its platform to a second nameplate. The Monzas inherited the aluminum block's tendency to warp, the body's commitment to rust, and the general engineering instability that the Vega's owners had been documenting since 1971. The Monza's 2+2 hatchback and town coupe variants looked more expensive than they were, which worked as advertising and less well as engineering. The access nightmare was specific to the optional V8, the 262 and 350 cubic inch engines GM shoehorned into an engine bay not designed for them. Replacing the rear spark plugs required unbolting the engine mount and lifting the block with a jack to create clearance. A 30-minute service became a 2-hour procedure that most shops billed accordingly. The Monza earns the second spot on this list because it represents General Motors at its most specifically cynical, continuing to sell a platform that its own warranty data had already condemned in a new body to buyers who had not yet heard about the Vega's long record or had decided the styling was worth the risk. The risk was not worth it. The warranty record confirmed this. GM knew before the first Monza left the lot. Best, number 2. Chevrolet Chevelle SS445. The Chevrolet Chevelle SS445 was the apex of what American muscle could produce before the emissions regulations, the insurance industry, and the fuel crisis arrived to end the conversation. The LS6 454 cubic inch engine in its most potent 1960 configuration produced 450 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque in a mid-size body that weighed approximately 3,800 pounds, numbers that period quarter-mile testing confirmed with elapsed times in the 13-second range at over 100 miles per hour from a stock, unmodified showroom car. No domestic mid-size car of the era went faster in a straight line. In 1971, GM reduced compression ratios across the lineup to accommodate low-lead and unleaded fuel. The buyer who signed a check in 1970 owned a 450 horsepower machine. By 1972, the LS6's rated output had been reduced to levels that made the 1970 specification look like a different engine, which it effectively was. The 1970 and 1971 Chevelle SS445 represent the specific 2-year period when American muscle car engineering reached its absolute domestic peak and then began the decline that the decade's regulatory environment made inevitable.
The Chevelle SS445 is the second best 1970s Chevy because those 2 years documented something that has not since been produced in the same configuration, an American mid-size family car whose factory specifications made it one of the fastest production vehicles in the world.
Worst. Number 1. Chevrolet Vega. The Chevrolet Vega was built in 30 months, roughly half the time GM's engineers required for a properly validated new platform, because the fuel-efficient subcompact market was growing and the Volkswagen Beetle was taking it. Motor Trend awarded the Vega its Car of the Year for 1971. The sleeveless aluminum block, topped with a heavy iron cylinder head, expanded at different rates when overheated. The head gaskets failed, the cylinder bores warped, the engine consumed oil at rates that made the weekly dipstick check a minimum, not a precaution. The body rusted at a pace that period road tests documented in the language of emergencies. General Motors issued 8 major recalls and multiple warranty extensions across the Vega's 7-year production run. None resolved the underlying problem, because the underlying problem was that the engine had been validated on a timeline that did not allow for the operating conditions it would actually encounter. 2 million Americans bought one. Sales declined from early peaks to 78,402 in 1977, the final year, a trajectory that captured what the recalls had not corrected. The Vega is the worst Chevrolet of the 1970s, not because no other Chevy failed as visibly, but because no other failure was so thoroughly documented, so widely experienced, and so clearly the result of a deliberate decision to ship a product that was not ready. 2 million Americans found out what not ready meant in the repair bay. Best. Number 1. Chevrolet Camaro Z28. The Chevrolet Camaro Z28 of the early 1970s was the most purpose-built high-performance street car in the Chevrolet lineup, a vehicle whose LT1 350 cubic-inch engine, heavy-duty power front disc brakes, and a purpose-built handling suspension had been developed with a clarity of engineering intent that the decade's regulatory pressures had not yet compromised. The 1970 Camaro's second-generation body, introduced mid-year, established proportions that automotive designers have been referencing for 5 decades. A fastback roofline, a wide stance, and a visual coherence that made it immediately recognizable as a purpose-built performance car rather than a family vehicle with a performance package bolted on. Period road tests from Car and Driver and Road and Track documented the early generation Z28's handling as among the best available from any production car in the American market, genuinely competitive against European sports cars that cost considerably more. The Z28's window closed by 1974, when the emissions requirements that had been arriving incrementally reduced the LT1's output to levels that made the 1970 to 1973 specification something that enthusiasts would spend decades attempting to restore and replicate. The Camaro Z28 of those 4 years is the best 1970s Chevrolet because it combined genuine engineering ambition with the regulatory freedom of a transitional moment. A car built at the last moment that was possible.